everyone. Welcome. I'm your host, Jeff Schulenberger. This is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors each week to discuss one of our articles. This week, I'm very honored to be joined by Angela Nagle, who is the author of what's still, in my view, and the view of many, the best book on, I suppose, how the internet went crazy over the past decade or so, Kill All Normies, which I imagine many listeners read. She also has a Substack where she's been writing about, most recently, how culture comes to flourish in particular places and times. And so anyway, Angela, thanks so much for joining me and also for contributing this piece, which is on the recent, at least to some observers, shocking riots in Dublin, in your home country of Ireland.
Great to be back.
You know, to begin, in the US, this was sort of going viral, like right when Thanksgiving was happening. So it was kind of this like weird thing in the background of like, whoa, that's odd. Why would there be riots in Ireland? I think people tend to think of it as a pretty placid place. And, you know, another thing that struck me and you know, that kind of touches on how you open the piece is I just wrote a long piece about Chile for American Affairs. The thing that these two things have in common is that Ireland, like Chile, is one of these countries that for decades was kind of pointed to by pundits of a certain, or, you know, pundits kind of across the center of the spectrum as like, here's what you want to, you know, this is the kind of country you want to emulate if you want to get rich and be successful. And so these were both kind of countries that were and continue to be treated as great success stories. And in Chile, you know, things kind of broke down. You know, something similar happened on a bigger scale. We'll see, you know, how things develop in Ireland. In 2019, there were huge protests, you know, which set in motion some big political changes, you know, and the way you open this piece is to say, if you look at the charts and numbers, again, that these kind of boosters would point to, everything seems to be great. And yet, you know, to anybody who's actually kind of paying attention to conditions on the ground, this isn't really surprising at all. So I suppose the question is, what have people been missing about what's going on in Ireland? You know, as there's kind of been this cheery story about its, you know, great success within the EU and the global economy.
The GDP is sort of like absurdly high, you know, and they even started using a different way of measuring it because it was sort of too implausible. It's basically because of the system, the economic system they have there, where the profits of multinationals that are run through there that kind of serve the European market primarily, right? So the European headquarters of everything basically is there, of all the tech companies and so on. And some of them are they have their plates there. They don't even employ anyone. Others, you know, have their headquarters there, but they have a completely international transient sort of tech staff. Originally, this idea, this model of the economy was sort of meant to be a supplement to developing native industry and business, but it ended up kind of swallowing it up so that there's like nothing left. And I mean, I think it's something like export part of the Irish economy is entirely foreign owned. You know, so it's sort of like I was thinking recently, it's sort of almost like a potato famine situation where we're now so reliant on one thing again that like if it ever just disappears, I mean, we don't really have a plan B. So the reason that kind of changes the political environment is that it's treated almost like a little flame that's about to go out. Like everyone in politics is sort of like going, oh God, no, just don't do anything that will disturb this in any way, you know? And so they know that basically anyone could pull the plug on this at any time. Like, I mean, the EU, I know like Macron, for example, has talked about this quite a lot, like threatening a kind of a single corporation tax for all of the European Union. So there's many other things too, many other kind of external forces wanting to change this situation. And like I say, there is no plan B. So that means that the Irish government are very afraid of doing anything else that is out of line in any way. And I think also they're also probably aware of the fact that Ireland has been historically neutral, and Irish people really want to hang on to that. It would be very difficult democratically to get to end kind of that as a norm. And so Ireland is also seen as kind of not really contributing when it comes to Ukraine and that whole situation. So if you put those two things together, they really don't want to rock the boat on any other issue. And so I suspect that is probably why they decided to take in such an enormous number of asylum seekers and refugees. I don't know if it's related, but I know that shortly before they did this, there was an agreed set of rules in the EU that they came to, where I think the rationale behind it was actually to spread out the burden, I suppose, of the refugee situation across Europe, so that it's not just Greece and Italy and Spain sort of like taking all of them. So I think that's probably why they did that, and why they feel that they have to be so pliant on this issue. But, Ireland has a very small population, so like it can't really absorb that many people, without just like really radically changing the place. You put on top of that also the fact that it's really the services and the kind of infrastructure. So the housing stock, the health services, which are two-tier a little bit. They're a bit of public and private. It's not actually the welfare. It's not the welfare payments that are going anywhere. I mean, they're very high actually, which is one of the reasons why we have kind of now a kind of foreign welfare class, which is part of what's making people angry as well. And this housing crisis has been going on for a very, very long time. I mean, really, as long as I can remember, as long as I've been an adult anyway, it's just been gradually getting worse and worse and worse. And so, people have been really struggling to even put a roof over their heads, basically. I mean, even middle-class people, it's just incredibly difficult to afford, just to rent even. So that's kind of, it's a kind of a fake economy where the most basic things in life are made extremely expensive. On top of that, you have this totally unexplained, sudden thing that happened where the government, I mean, certainly led the public to believe that they were sort of like helping Ukrainians fleeing war, and people imagined that that's what they were going to find. And then it turned out that wasn't what they were doing at all, really. And it was actually just refugees from all over the world coming in huge numbers. I mean, I know that sort of everyone is familiar with the situation of, I guess, political correctness or whatever. That's sort of everywhere. But you really have to stress, like in Ireland, is like there isn't even a word of dissent anywhere allowed. Other than people just going on social media or something like that, in the newspapers, on the television, there isn't even like, moderate conservative type of voice or anything like that. Their attitude is basically being, this is an illegitimate topic and we're not discussing it. The government used in their own words, they said there is no limit to the numbers that we could potentially take in. So basically what they are saying to Irish people is, we don't have any plan to solve any of these economic problems. They're going to get worse, indefinitely. And also, with no housing stock and no housing for even the people who already live here, we're going to also bring in an unlimited number of people. We're not going to tell you from where. We're not going to tell you why. We're not going to tell you how many. We're not going to tell you when it will end. We're not going to tell you anything. I mean, it's just like unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, even when I think of something like equivalent in terms of scale, like relative to population, something like, when Merkel did something similar. But I mean, she actually did explain pretty much what she was doing and why. In the Irish case, it's just been completely mysterious. And then to add to, in a time of, a very conspiratorial sort of zeitgeist, they then start, just busing people in to these places in the middle of the night, and with security kind of not letting people in, and even like pushing them away and stuff like that. It's just a crazy situation, absolutely crazy. I mean, by any standards, even if I was pro-immigration sort of maximalist, I don't think that anyone could possibly say that this is well handled or that this was a good policy or that it isn't just a policy disaster. The government's approach to this has just been, we're just going to brazen this out. We're just going to keep going and we're just going to slam hate speech legislation down on top of this in the hope that it will bury the problem. That's literally their plan.
It's really quite extraordinary. The point I'm taking from this is it would seem that, perhaps there are things going on behind the scenes here where Ireland's kind of fragile position in relation to wealthier and more powerful countries within the European Union is kind of putting it in a place where it can sort of get points in its favor to continue extracting certain benefits, although these benefits don't go to most of the public, by essentially agreeing to deal with this problem, refugee problem, or at least, help mitigate it in other areas.
A lot of people are saying they're blaming the EU, basically, right? Now, there is some, that does make sense up to a certain point. But the thing is, as in most things with the EU, there is actually an opt-out, which, for example, Denmark has done. So the government chose to do this. They opted in to do this. I just think that blaming the EU is sort of easy and possibly, just when people are angry, it's the most obvious thing to point to. But ultimately, the government did choose to do this. And that's why I think they did, basically.
This does kind of raise a broader question that what does this reveal about what is the nature of the Irish sort of ruling class? Whatever the ruling class more broadly and the institutions that it's embedded in, including, corporate ones, but also NGOs.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I use the term comprador in the piece to describe them. I think it's the best sort of a colonial term, but it is the best way to describe them because they're really they're managing. If you're like the manager of a supermarket or something and you have bigger dreams to go on to something else afterwards, that's like the way they are. They all want to be like Mary Robinson after this, the former president. They want to get international, positions. They really do treat it very much like just something that has to be managed on behalf of bigger powers on the outside. And those are many. I mean, there's the EU, obviously, there's, NATO, there's Washington, there's the UN, there's international capitalism, international finance. They're serving all of these things simultaneously, really. They're just managing this piece of land where all of this important business is run through. It's amazing to see how contemptuous they are of the people who live there, And I suppose their view is that, well, if we push this down with hate speech legislation and we just don't allow any other political alternative, they're not going to be able to vote us out anyway. So, we'll just everyone be in lockstep. Every newspaper, every radio show, every political party, just 100% consensus on this. Now, the thing that I wonder, though, is like, there's one, okay, I had a particular person in mind. I mean, she probably would never do this, but there's a woman in the Social Democrats. There's the Social Democrat Party in Ireland, right? And they're kind of new. And I kind of thought for a while there, a few months ago, it looked like she was getting skeptical, like she might actually break ranks on this. And then she was frightened away from it. She obviously faced backlash, probably internally and so on. But what I always think is like, why wouldn't one of them just think, if I'm the one person who gives voice to this, I'll be like a hero, any political party would just sweep into power if they even took a moderate position on this, like some level of being reasonable or listening to anyone, would be wildly popular, but they just don't do it. And I suspect that will probably, I wonder how that will end. Like I mentioned in the piece, I was actually quoting another writer, Conor Fitzgerald. He talked about this like consensus collapse that happens in Ireland. It happened with the Catholic Church, for example. And it's like suddenly everyone is really, really, really pro-abortion. Or suddenly everyone is really, really, really pro-gay. And it's like 5 minutes ago, they were all really, really, really pro-Catholic Church. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's just so completely, they really just have no, there's no independent thought whatsoever there. I mean, and I just wonder, will there be a consensus collapse here where they'll all suddenly be in lockstep again, but on the other side of this issue? But I don't know if that will happen, because I think in this case, the outside forces are against that happening. So I actually don't think that will happen. Maybe, for example, if the EU officially changes its position, then something like that could happen. The other thing too to remember about Ireland is the point that Desmond Fennell used to make, and I think of it every time I try to analyze this stuff, because it's unusual in Europe, kind of, which is that Ireland basically lost its native aristocracy centuries ago, like through being killed and exiled, because it was always being attacked by the British Empire, and so it's gone through these cycles throughout its history of having these kind of temporary outside elites coming in. Like my own surname is a Norman name, right? They were one of many waves of people to come in. A lot of the famous Irish writers that people know, Yeats and Bram Stoker and Jonathan Swift and people like that, they were Anglo-Irish, right? So it's sort of like, it's like a motherless child or something, it doesn't have a continuous native elite at all, really. And so it's very vulnerable for that reason. And so that's why this kind of these like managers basically are just there, and they don't really have any idealism or feelings of loyalty or anything of that nature. They have places to go after their political career is done, and so they what they really ensure is that they have served the larger outside powers that they want to go on to afterwards. And in terms of the NGOs, I mean, they're huge. I suspect Ireland must have, an outsized number of them compared to any other country. I don't know if it has the most, but it's got to be up there. It is kind of a bit of a stand-in Catholic Church, really, because they operate very much like a priest class in that sense. And people defer to them in the same way, And it really shows that, at some point, Irish people, if you're listening, we have to have some kind of like serious reckoning about the fact that, the Catholic Church was just kind of the software. Like, if you replace it with something else, the problem is still there. And the problem is, it could have been anything, right? It just happened to have been the church. But the problem is that we have this unusual level of deference to moral bullies, to be brutal about it. Like, we just don't have any kind of Enlightenment culture. We don't have an Enlightenment kind of public square in any way. There's no sense of like a norm of having a dialectical sort of exchange of ideas going on all the time. And so what happens instead is you go through a really long period of absolute 100% deference to moral bullies. Life becomes totally unbearable, and everyone is starting to be privately angry about it. And then one day it collapses, and everyone suddenly latches onto a new thing. But that's the problem, right? Because let's say a party comes along, like an outside anti-establishment party comes along, and they take a position against this, right? I fear that what will happen is that their set of ideas will just become the new thing that everyone defers to. So I do think at some point, I mean, I would hope for people, especially kind of Irish people younger than me, that I would love to see a time where younger people would get to live in a society that had a place for dissenters, kind of, and, that they didn't have to. I mean, that's the other thing too. They didn't have to leave, I was going to say. The other thing about this, I mean, one of the reasons why kind of understanding it as a pro versus anti-immigration thing doesn't really work is that because what always happens is, right, the Irish yuppies or whatever will say, oh, but Irish people emigrated everywhere. That's like the generic thing that they always say. But we know that and actually that's not good. Like, the problem is that Irish young people, they go through the education process, and then they find that they can't afford to rent, let alone buy a home or have any prospect of that whatsoever. And they end up leaving. So that's going on at the same time as this. It's just a totally chaotic situation with no plan. Like, for example, Ireland produces lots of, nurses, right? Nurses and doctors. So all of our nurses are abroad, but then foreign nurses come in there doesn't seem to be anyone like figuring out like what's going wrong here. Like, how do we actually train people and then have them stay and not have to replace them? But it's sort of like, the managers, because to them it's sort of like a football team where they just buy all the players from other countries, and it doesn't matter that the word on the jersey is totally unconnected to any of the people playing on it. That's basically like how the Irish political class view managing the country. It doesn't matter to them as long as the multinationals are there, the GDP is high, they haven't annoyed anyone important abroad. That's their job done.
So interesting detail I just recalled during this conversation is, which I think speaks to the short-sightedness of a lot of the right, whether it's the sort of MAGA right in the U.S. or kind of dissident or whatever, anti-establishment right more broadly. So the anti-establishment right, recently celebrated something that we've covered in Compacts, which is the victory of the outsider candidate Javier Milei in Argentina. Now, an interesting detail was he did an interview with The Economist earlier this year, in which he said that Ireland was the model for what he would want to do with Argentina. God. And he says, it's a miracle. It's one of the greatest, economic achievements of, recent times, because he's kind of sounding off the sort of culture war or whatever, anti-woke talking points and so on. He sounds like he's got the right approach to these people. But, in fact, the exact economic model that he's promising to implement, we have the results are in, and they're essentially what you're describing. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't see why they don't think that like there's a connection between economic sovereignty and other types of sovereignty, right? Like when you lose that economic sovereignty, you lose everything else as well. You stop being able to call the shots, basically, in your own country. That's the way it works. I mean, you are actually selling out your country, basically, when you do that. But then this is another problem, too, which is, this is something I'll write about at some point, because you have to keep, there are so many layers to this. So let's say, for example, if a different political party comes in or whatever, different, or something happens where Ireland's current economic model is destroyed. First of all, it will be absolutely catastrophic and they're just not prepared for it at all. But let's just say it happens. We know how you build up a national economy from scratch, basically. Not absolutely from scratch, because we have roads and things like that. But pretty much from scratch. We don't have any native industries. The way you do that is a whole bunch of policies that is not allowed in the EU. We would have to use national protectionism. You can't do that. You'd have to get out enormous loans to capitalize, a couple of national champions. I don't think that the governing class are like sinister. I think they're, just like I said, they're like a manager of a supermarket, a manager of a football team where no one's from the country. They're not sinister. They're just technocrats, and they're looking at this coldly and just saying, we are screwed if anything gets in the way of this very delicate thing that we've built. And there's no plan B, so they have to just go along with whatever it is. If you think about, I mentioned earlier Denmark, right? Denmark opted out of this stuff in the EU because it is optional. But Denmark has been really, really pro-NATO and very on board with that, very much like taking a leading role on the pro-Ukraine side. I suspect that they cut them a bit of slack in the way that they didn't with, say, Viktor Orban. Because it is strange. People often comment on it, like, how are they getting away with this when any other country that tries to do it is sort of demonized internationally? And I suspect that's the reason. I think they were probably given a free pass because of that. That's just my hunch. In the case of Ireland, like I say, they are, on thin ice with the low corporation tax. We're not contributing anything to NATO or the war effort. When Ireland joined the EU, it was actually pretty infrastructurally underdeveloped. So we did actually take a lot of development money in the early years. And we're not anymore, but we did. So they also have a sense that they kind of owe a debt to the EU as well. Somebody like Millet, I mean, like he's just anti-abortion or something like that. I mean, goes around with a chainsaw. I mean, it's very like it's very shallow stuff to be impressed by, you know. Like if you don't understand that the Industrial Revolution, basically, right, we're all in a development race, basically. That's just the nature of, you know, the modern world. So you don't really, you know, have a choice in that, you know, because sometimes I hear some of these people saying things like, you know, you shouldn't have such a materialist like view of things, that they're, you know, but the thing is, like, if you live in the industrial age, like, you have to, because that's just the game that's being played, right? And so if somebody like him is making the national economy less sovereign, then the repercussions of that are going to be less political sovereignty, less every kind of sovereignty. And at that point, you really are just like a pawn to outside powers. And that is the Irish model, basically, you know, like that has been the price of that high GDP. And, you know, when it does eventually fall apart, I don't know how much we're going to really have to show for it, because they didn't invest in the way that they could have. There are so many infrastructural projects they could have done. There's a lot they could have done that maybe they're trying at the last minute. I mean, I know that there are some attempts to build up sort of renewable energies and things like that. Actually, I think I remember reading a detail that Chile has the most advanced wave power, because Ireland was sort of looking to that as something that we could do as well. We could have done a lot more with at least the small tax take that is there. But yeah, if it does ever come to that, I mean, and we have to sort of build up the national economy again from scratch, it's very hard to see how we can do that within the EU. And it is going to be very, very difficult.
My impression is you've been interested in this whole question of nation building and sort of building national economies. You know, going back to the work of Friedrich List, as I recall.
Yeah.
And then, you know, more recently, you've kind of shifted not to, you know, from economy to culture, you know, and these are obviously related things.
Yeah.
They can't really totally separate it, but how cultures are built up in particular times, you know, and sort of cultural, you know, riches are built up. These questions about Ireland are very, very much of a piece with the work and writing you've been doing more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when the nationalist movement in Ireland, or the movement for national independence in Ireland, was very much a cultural and economic and political one at the same time. You know, there were very economistic sort of thinkers, and there was also a cultural revival sort of movement that was very rich. I mean, it was amazing, actually. It was one of those moments in history where every great artist and writer and whatever is like living right beside each other, sort of in Dublin, like at the same time, you know. Yeah, so how I became interested in that was I basically followed Eric Reinert's other canon economic history work that he did. And so I went through for a year or two, I think I just went and read through all the bits to fill in all the bits that I had really been missing. You know, as a leftist, you only know Marx and you know Keynes and you know a couple of things like that. But when you kind of see the full picture and how these ideas developed and how they were all in dialogue with each other the whole way, it really just like it's amazing. Actually, it really gave me a much greater understanding of the history of development. That in turn gives you a better understanding of politics, because it's a knock-on effect. And I kind of reached a point where I had satisfied myself to a point where like I felt that I had filled in a lot of those blanks, right? But then I thought, okay, but what about the cultural aspect of this? Because I suppose because of the pressure coming from China, right? The America and the European Union as well is kind of taking industrial policy ideas like straight from the 19th century much more seriously than they would have in the past, because it wasn't geopolitically, in their interests in the recent past. But now it is again, right? Because they have a rival who's doing really just repeating what Europe and what America did in the past. On a basic material level, that's all China is doing. So it's a kind of a state, an industry, kind of an entrepreneurial state. But then I thought, like, why don't we apply these ideas, or why don't we apply this level of seriousness to the question of culture and cultural development? Sometimes it's almost like I could envision a future where there's just nothing but economists, and there's nothing else really being discussed, and culture just dies completely. The other thing too is that, most of the really beautiful culture that people travel across the world to see and that people are totally in awe of is religious or aristocratic. That's true all over the world. So we're in a secular age with no aristocracy. So what has filled in the gap in between is basically being mass culture, or culture that could be made through being profitable. So like Hollywood and things like that. But now that's coming to an end as well, because the internet has kind of messed up the profit model of all these things. So I'm kind of trying to take on that big question with the sense of urgency and the practicality, the kind of realism that those people, lists and all these figures that I admire, that they applied to development. I'm kind of trying to bring a bit of that spirit to this question. What I mean by that is, like, when people write and speak about culture, they tend to get very vague and very imprecise and kind of carried away with overly romanticizing the artistic process and things like that. Like, just assuming that it's just something in the air, or that, it just springs from the individual heart, kind of like spontaneously, that kind of thing, right? But actually, the thing that really struck me, the reason I kind of made the connection between this development stuff and the cultural stuff, is that when I started looking through the history of culture, and I looked at periods that were very, that we still admire today, and that, where there was a lot of flourishing happening in a relatively small amount of time in maybe just one city or something like that. What I found is that the patronage model, the economic model behind it, basically was the main factor that I could see distinguishing it. Like, so you'll often find even like a period of flourishing will be bookended by the beginning and end of an actual political regime. The very first time this kind of occurred to me was when I was looking at this book, which was on the history of stained glass, right? And it went through different periods of style. And then I thought, well, every period of style here is actually a period of patronage. Like, so one chapter, for example, was on like the grand cathedrals. Another one was on much smaller scale stuff that was in homes, private homes. Well, that's when bourgeoisie started to develop, right? And they wanted like beautiful art pieces in their own homes. So, like, in other words, like the artist is adapting to the times. Another example would be like the Bauhaus had the exact like beginning and end dates of the Weimar Republic. Like you can like just. This is very consistent across time, from what I can see, that the model of patronage defines the style. And so, well, it makes the style possible, we'll say, right? And so I want to try and take all those questions and then bring them and then add to them the current problem, which is the fact that the internet has disrupted the mass culture model, which kind of filled in for the absence of, religious and aristocratic art. It could totally be that we just forget about culture and we just become Philistines and we just just watch people playing video games on YouTube, and we, because what the internet is providing is basically entertainment without the need of art, really. Mass culture like Hollywood and things like that fused entertainment and art, you know what I mean? So that it would be commercially viable. But if you can provide like very addictive, entertaining, stimulating stuff that doesn't have any artistic aspect whatsoever, then, I mean, commercially, there's no reason for art, basically, or there's no reason for anyone to bother investing in it.
Except, I suppose, as an asset class, right? That is why you have this kind of bizarre phenomenon of like these huge warehouses that are full of contemporary artworks that are just sitting in crates because they've been purchased by collectors. Patrons of the past, had a certain pride in the skill that was put on display, and there are various things you can read about this in the Renaissance and so on. But these are not patrons. I mean, they are patrons in the sense that they're paying top dollar for these contemporary works of dubious value, but at the same time, they're often just stashing them away in these, tax havens.
Yeah, you can even buy, I know there's some app where you can buy like 5% of a painting kind of thing. You just get that amount of whatever it increases in value. But yeah, it's just tasteless people with no real interest in art, just selling Basquiats back and forth to each other all over the world, which they may not even see or even have up in their homes. Yeah, it's pure investment. I mean, it's like buying and selling wine or whiskey that you never drink,
Anyway, I think obviously the first part of this conversation, we mapped out the absurdity and kind of, seeming insolubility or intractability of the situation in Ireland. But it does seem like following your Substack, you're at least, have some cautious hope that positive political economy and, perhaps more positive culture might reemerge at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the reasons why I took such inspiration from those figures like Reinhardt, and then as I went back through it, all the other figures that he looks at, Liszt and others, is that they basically, out of desperation, were forced to figure out, like, how do we get out of this situation? Like the whole school of German, like, economic thought basically came out of a devastating war where before they had built up any great industry or whatever, the country was completely devastated. And you often find that, I mean, in the history of really good development ideas, that they come out of a period of desperation, trying to figure out like how to get out of prison or something like that. Like, yeah, actually, funnily enough, the first political economy book was literally an attempt to get out of prison because they're trying to come up with what is a truly useful idea. Right? Like, how can I just use raw brain power to get out of this situation? Because if we don't, people will starve, the country will be ruined. And so I just thought, like, that's what sharpened their minds so much. They didn't have the time to indulge in abstractions. They had to really be correct. And they had to really, like, just look with total realism at the historical record, and say, why did this development happen here at this time? And I just think that if we took that approach, that would be very useful. If you could figure that out in many different aspects of life, that it would provide a sort of map for how to improve the situation. I guess like I had written so much stuff in the past that was kind of critiquing, and I kind of felt like it was time to actually try to come up with useful ideas.
Well, I encourage listeners to subscribe to your Substack at angelanagel.substack.com for, your previous work in this area, as well as, this is an ongoing project, so there will be more to come. So, and beyond that, we hope to have you in the pages of Compact again. So
yeah,
listeners should look out for that. So thanks so much, Angela. It's great to talk. I think you've provided insights into this Irish situation that people genuinely can't find anywhere else. So
yeah. Great. Thank you.
So thanks so much to you, and thanks to listeners. That's it for this week's Compact Conversations. As always, remember, Compact is an independent reader-supported publication. We need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. So please subscribe if you have not at compactmag.com/subscribe to access all of our content, including Angela's recent piece, as well as gain priority access to our events. Please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels and give us 5 stars if you like what you're hearing. Thanks, and until next time.